Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. Going into 2021, the pandemic is now killing more people, shutting down more nonprofits and small businesses, along with wiping out the livelihoods of families, neighborhoods, and communities. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
I think that when we start thinking about poverty in the Bay Area, which again, I just want to reiterate, here in this region, I have to believe that it is solvable. And I know that's crazy to say because of how complex the problems are, but we have all the resources in this region. And I think when applied appropriately and strategically and with flexibility, we can really change opportunities for people. And I think that we've seen various examples of that through our kind of multi-pronged approach.
This is the Chief Program Officer, Kelly Bathgate, and Communications Director, Marisa Giller of Tipping Point Community. Tipping Point Community was founded by Daniel Lurie back in 2005 with a systematic approach to ending the cycle of poverty for over 1+ million of our fellow community members in the San Francisco Bay Area. Tipping Point's model is different from a traditional philanthropic organization or a foundation. Tipping Point sits right in the middle between incredible wealth and incredible poverty. Their board of directors covers their overhead. They utilize all of their funding to have 100% impact. They have no endowment, and every year they start at zero to raise millions of dollars to fund nonprofits in their 4 key issue areas that Kelly and Marisa will walk us through today. I'm joined remotely via Zoom by Kelly Bathgate, the Chief Program Officer, and Marisa Giller, the Communications Director at Tipping Point Community. Thanks for being here, Kelly and Marisa.
Thanks for having me, George.
It would be really wonderful for the audience to have an overview, and then we can go into a little bit more depth of the amazing portfolio of programs that Tipping Point has. So could you please share with the audience, what is Tipping Point and what are your portfolio of programs?
Sure. As you said, there's a lot that we do. So I'll start with the top. Tipping Point is a Bay Area, San Francisco-based foundation, and our mission is to advance poverty-fighting solutions here in the Bay Area. We do that by investing in nonprofit organizations through general operating grants and then providing additional capacity building support to help them grow stronger and have greater impact with the communities that they are serving. We focus on 4 key issue areas that we kind of see as the key levers for alleviating poverty: education, housing, early childhood, and employment. And within each of those, we have kind of key targets and goals that we have. In addition, we have a few particular initiatives that are focused on specific populations. So many people have heard of our chronic homelessness initiative here in San Francisco, which is aiming to reduce the number of chronically homeless people here in San Francisco by half by 2023. And we also have initiatives focused specifically on foster youth and providing the right supports for transitional age youth who will be transitioning out of the system and ensuring that the system is providing them with what they need to be successful in adulthood.
And then you have an entire research component as well. And then you're lobbying. I think another really interesting piece of what you do is the corporate philanthropy piece. So can you talk a little bit about the research piece, but then also you're going out to corporate philanthropies and say, please put your money where you say your values are?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's really unique and great about Tipping Point is that we sit in a position in between a lot of the work that our organizations are doing and an incredibly generous and influential donor population too. So recently, within the last few years, we've expanded from just investing in direct service organizations to lifting up and thinking, okay, what is it going to take to actually move the needle on poverty? And realizing that, well, the direct services that our grantees are providing are critical, and we have to continue to invest in that to be kind of the strong nonprofit ecosystem that's serving people directly. We need to think about how we can expand that to have a greater impact through policy solutions to extend that impact, as well as researching solutions that we may not know of yet. So within each of our areas, we have kind of a dynamic set of research questions that we are continually asking to see what solutions do we not even know about? How can we particularly focus on a population that may be disproportionately impacted by a challenge, that kind of thing. And so that helps us invest in what we think will be most effective. And then on the policy side, within each of our portfolio areas that I named, we have an anchor policy organization that aligns with what we're trying to make happen so that our organizations who are on the ground serving people have the most success doing that, and the success that they are able to have can be extended through leveraging additional public resources and potential legislation or regulations to help extend that impact.
So within education, you would have a policy with regards to funding education and or a partner organization that's helping you facilitate that.
Yeah, that's a great example. So within education, our anchor policy organization is Ed Trust West, based in Oakland. And within that, speaking of kind of education financing, what we are really focused on is equitable and consistent financing. And so one thing that we know is a great challenge for schools, particularly those that are serving low-income children, that the streams of funding that come from public sources are greatly supplemented often in some of the wealthier suburbs. And so how do we ensure that the schools who need the most support are getting adequate resources? The other thing is that because of state budgeting, the resources that are coming in sometimes can vary from year to year. And so it can be, as you can imagine, incredibly challenging to provide a high quality education without that level of consistency in budget planning.
And then you would go out to corporations and say, we have this education program. And by the way, could you each put in $10 million, which I find really, it's crowdsourcing on a whole other level. Can you share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I forgot to touch on the corporate partnership piece. So yeah, I think that our fundraising, we are able to connect with a variety of obviously individual donors, but also corporations. And I think that where there can be the greatest opportunity for impact, particularly in a region like the Bay Area, where there are just so many incredible companies and leaders within the world, really garnering those resources to focus on the problems at hand. And so, yes, we might go to a corporation and say, there's this particular issue we want you to invest in. Or more broadly speaking, I'm a big believer that all of our quote unquote issue areas are intersected. And so it really is, if we're going to take care of our community of the Bay Area, and we know we have so much wealth here, and I would say not just financial wealth, but wealth of knowledge, wealth of innovation, and of course, wealth financially as well. How do we pool all of those resources and really make poverty something that is solvable here in the Bay Area?
So I want to segue back for a second into kind of research, because it dovetails into my next question as well, with regards to how COVID-19 has impacted your portfolio of nonprofit organizations. But in your most recent research, has your research kind of teased out some of the impact on nonprofits? For example, my end of the year show, I interviewed the folks at Candid, and they estimate that 12 to as high as 38% of nonprofits could conceivably go away in the United States. So in the Bay Area specifically, in your mission of trying to alleviate poverty, what does some of your indicators, your dashboard, your research show? How is COVID-19 impacting folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we've really seen, and this isn't that surprising, but COVID-19 is impacting our core population, low-income people, so much further than others. And so what we're really seeing that from looking at those who have lost employment, so hourly wage workers, workers who don't have flexibility to work at home, workers who may not be eligible for the other financial resources because of their immigration status, and their disproportionate impacts of that. At the same time, we're seeing our nonprofit organizations really be inundated with more service numbers when they are having much greater challenges themselves, raising funds and planning, like we were talking about the importance of planning and financial and budgeting, really not having that certainty for how they pivot and serve more individuals and in new and different ways.
One of the unique things about Tipping Point is that you're actually doing something that now big philanthropy has come to understand over this last 10 months of COVID, and that is funding general operations. So can you share a little bit about what you guys look for, the metrics and measurements, if you will, of your core research, but how you're funding general overhead, which is unusual in the philanthropy world, as you know?
Yeah, I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood. And unfortunately, it hasn't changed that much since I first started at Tipping Point nearly 10 years ago. But I believe the range is somewhere between 25 and 30% of all philanthropic dollars come out in general operating. We are just an incredible advocate of general operating support for nonprofit organizations. And I think a lot of that is driven from an approach that really, obviously, we do a ton of due diligence and ensure that we are vetting the organizations that we invest in, but we also want to make sure that we are setting them up for success as much as possible. And if you think about how businesses are run or how any other kind of sector works, to not have flexibility in the funding that you have to, as a leader, to make the decisions, to be able to pivot in moments such as COVID is a perfect example. We just really think it can result in sort of hamstrung organizations and hamstrung leaders. And so I think it's a critical component of what we're doing. And I would say it's a great example of something that we've sort of seen validated through the current crisis that we're going through.
So what do you feel has been the largest impact on the community of Tipping Point's efforts and your ability to multiply your impact through corporate philanthropy, but multiply it through the intersectionality of your approach?
I mean, there's so much to say to that. I definitely think that I'll speak both kind of long-term, but also specifically now in COVID. I think one thing that we saw right off the bat was our ability to get resources out to our grantee organizations who are on the ground serving people within, I think we launched our emergency effort 3 days before the shelter in place order here in the Bay Area. We raised a bunch of money and then we're able to get $5 million out within the first 3 months. And all of those dollars were direct support for individuals facing hardship. So rental support, food access, technology, and ensuring that our organizations were able to continue to provide, really going back to kind of basic needs for individuals. I think that was huge. I would also say, kind of to your point about that kind of collective impact, we immediately stood up a weekly meeting. It was honestly intended, I think, the Friday before our shelter in place, just as everyone was kind of scared and not knowing what this meant and what should we be thinking about. And one of, I think, Tipping Point's biggest strengths is our grantee leadership. And they are a community that we have the opportunity to convene so that they can just really learn from and support each other. So we had a kind of last minute Zoom call that we planned. And it was funny. I'll be honest, at the time, I was like, oh, no camera. Like, why would we ever do camera on Zoom? And all these faces started popping up. And we have probably a little over 60 leaders in our portfolio. And everyone started popping up and putting their cameras on and then immediately asked, can we do this every week? Just to have that community. And so I think when you really bring in that kind of collective thought partnership, everyone from folks that are leading schools and education efforts to leading some of our biggest housing organizations to employment programs. And it was just really able to look at the problem collectively. And then I would say, honestly, that's a version of the same answer I would say long term. I think that when we start thinking about poverty in the Bay Area, which again, I just want to reiterate, here in this region, I have to believe that it is solvable. And I know that's crazy to say because of how complex the problems are, but we have all the resources in this region. And I think when applied appropriately and strategically and with flexibility, we can really change opportunities for people. And I think that we've seen various examples of that through our kind of multi-pronged approach.
For people listening to this, what are some of the numbers? Like, what's the percentage of children in poverty, families that live in poverty in the Bay Area? Because I think that's a good picture to paint for people.
Yeah, let's see. So we have within, and this is funny, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but we have specific targets that we are aiming for. We're looking at it as both kind of a long-term 10-year projection as well as 3-year goals within each of our issue areas. So I can say, for an example, we know that in education, we really are focusing on getting low-income and first-generation students to college. And so that is a primary goal of ours. We have set goals within the next 3 years of what we need to do that. And then looking at that kind of contextually, let's say within kind of our focus area to see what, this is a terrible term, but like what is the market share of that and what would we really need to see to move the needle? Again, I don't have the numbers exactly in front of me, so I can't say as specifically to that question.
Marisa, do you have numbers in front of you want to add to it?
One of the things that I was thinking about is our study that we did with UC Berkeley called Take and Count that we did right before COVID hit. So released the results back in, well, actually it was May, but we had the results right in March of last year.
I will say that study is an example of the research that we do so that we have the context of the kind of size of the problem that we're trying to solve. Things like how many months of savings people have, what percentage of people have 4 months of savings, how many people can actually pay their bills every month. And those are the exact indicators that have been so exacerbated by, it's like savings in the time of emergency. And then here we have one of the biggest emergencies any of us have ever experienced.
Over the years that you've worked at Tipping Point, do you have a favorite story of Tipping Point's work in the community?
Yeah, so I really think that moment when we hosted our first Zoom call the Friday before shelter in place, and we had no idea what was coming before us. I will be honest, when Sam Cobbs, our CEO, told me that he wanted me to plan what an emergency response would look like to COVID, I kind of rolled my eyes and was like, are you serious? Like, are you really believing this too? So I was certainly proven wrong in that instance, but we were prepared to do that. And we knew that kind of when all else fails, to go back to our community and that strength of our grantees and their leadership. And I'm a very visual person. So the visual pop-up of all these faces, just clearly gaining comfort in each other and feeling that like, okay, we can do this regardless of what comes. That is what I love about this work. And that is where I find inspiration. I have so many different stories, and it always goes back to our grantees and both the leaders that we get to work with, but the people that they serve, and just finding true strength and inspiration from that.
So someone who's listening to this, how can they get engaged with Tipping Point? You have an entire portfolio. So if someone wanted to donate, obviously we can't volunteer yet, but how can folks get engaged in helping your mission to alleviate poverty in our Bay Area?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I feel like this is always such a good question. And now in particular, when people can't necessarily in-person volunteer as easily as we once can, it's a good one. First, I would say donate, obviously, is a wonderful way to support organizations right now. There is no shortage of need, certainly. And then I also would say just stay educated. I think that there are a lot of misperceptions about poverty. It's certainly the most complex thing I've ever worked on. And I think staying educated and staying engaged in the issues so that you really understand and can have good conversations with your friends over your Zoom happy hours or whatever you're doing. And then just stay engaged at the kind of higher level. I think that obviously a few months ago we would say vote, and that is still very true, even though the most recent election has passed us. But taking that education and making sure that you're putting it to action. There is now such opportunity to take this moment and really grow from it and really make it a catalyst to really create the Bay Area and the overall community that we really can. And I think that we need a fully engaged community and population to do that.
Which leads me into my final question, which is kind of a two-parter. First part is, what are some of the good things that you could see coming out of this? And then the second part, because you work with so many organizations and empowering them, what are some of the common themes of solutions that you've seen people come up with?
Yeah, great question. When we launched our emergency response, we really thought about it in 3 phases. Obviously, there's a need to get money out the door and get resources and food and rent payments out to people in that initial response. And then really thinking about what we're going to need to stand up the nonprofit community so that they continue serving people through a relief kind of phase of that, which we're hopefully getting to soon. To me, the most exciting part about this is really thinking about recovery and what rebuilding looks like. Hopefully we never go back to, everyone is saying this, but let's never go back to quote unquote normal. very specifically thinking about some of the work that we're talking to folks about. How do we use this as an opportunity to make sure that every student in our schools is a one-to-one district, meaning that every student has a device that they can learn on, and every household has internet connectivity? That is something, again, particularly here in the Bay Area, you think we can make happen. And so how do we make sure that we use this as an opportunity to make that happen? Obviously, with virtual school, it's critical. It's always critical, because that learning and that divide that happens without having that connectivity really, really contributes to the opportunity gap. How do we think about being more flexible with housing, thinking about how we get people housed and safe, thinking about that far beyond your traditional shelters, your traditional units, but thinking how can the state and nonprofits and the counties come together and really think about, as my colleague Chris Block said, broadening the solution set to think about housing as the critical kind of foundation to everything else it is. How do we take workforces and build out new skill sets in this time to respond very rapidly? Obviously, there are new opportunities now. We have an investment to develop a contact tracing workforce. How do you take that and translate it into opportunities in a quick way? I just think that there's so many opportunities so that we never have a situation where people are so disproportionately impacted, and that we can really get people the basic needs that they have, regardless of what comes down the line.
And then I think, to your point, engagement.
Yeah. COVID is just one piece, as we know, of what many people are calling the kind of triple pandemic of the last year. And again, I always say that I have my optimistic days and my less optimistic days. If we're calling today one of my more optimistic days, I have to believe that we will come out of this stronger and more engaged about not just what's happening right in front of us and what's happening in our own lives, but realizing that we're all connected, and that to engage on issues that are affecting others in a much more regular way, and not just when it's the only thing that's on the news and the only thing you're hearing or talking about. I'm hopeful that we'll get there because of everything that we've experienced over the last year.
And so, Marisa and Kelly, is there anything I haven't asked that you would like to talk about today?
We talk a lot, George, about the idea of philanthropic capital is putting it to use as risk capital, and how philanthropy can take risks that government can't. So investing in new ideas or new ways of doing things. And we have one project in development right now, a building in Soma. It's located at 833 Bryant.
So Kelly, can you tell me a little bit about the Bryant Street project?
Yeah, sure. The 833 Bryant project is part of our chronic homeless initiative. And we're really thinking about that as a way to show how, with philanthropic support, we can be more efficient or more effective in creating new units. So a big challenge here in San Francisco, which obviously has such expensive housing, is obviously the cost per unit and the time it takes to get a new unit created. And so this project, by using philanthropic support as sort of an impetus, and then by using modular units, we are able to cut the cost by 30% and then also reduce the time it takes by several years. And so we're hoping to use this. Obviously, 145 new units is a wonderful thing. And we're hoping to essentially use it as a proof point so that in the future, public dollars can be used in a similar way. And we can continue to recycle those philanthropic dollars to continue to seed new innovative projects.
Thank you. That was great. I want to thank you, Kelly and Marisa, for sharing Tipping Point Community's work today. We will make sure that listeners and viewers have your contact information, website, and social media so they can follow all of Tipping Point Community's work and get engaged with the Tipping Point portfolio of nonprofits. Please stay safe out there as we all work our way through our strange new normal, which hopefully will get better with more vaccines.
Yes, we will soon. Thank you, George. It's great to talk to you.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of Kelly Bathgate, the Chief Program Officer, and Marisa Giller, the Communications Director at Tipping Point Community. Marisa mentioned the Taking Count study on poverty in the San Francisco Bay Area. The study was conducted by sociologists and political scientists from UC Berkeley, the Othering and Belonging Institute, and Tipping Point Community. The Taking Count study was a panel survey conducted between 2018 and 2019 prior to the COVID-19 pandemic's historic impact on the Bay Area. The study was published in May of 2020. Here are some of the findings from the study. Of the 7.75 million people in the 9 counties of the San Francisco Bay Area, 17% of the residents are living in poverty. 1 in 2 households cannot pay all of their bills over the course of a year. 30% of households went without essentials, such as food, shelter, and medicine, because they could not afford them. 4 out of 10 Bay Area families do not have savings to cover 3 months of expenses, and 1 in 5 have less than $400 for an emergency. For more context on what is poverty, there are 2 definitions of poverty from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Low income level, which is defined as households with gross annual income of less than $25,844, and deep poverty, which is defined as gross annual income of less than $12,922. According to the Public Policy Institute of California's 2019 study of census tract data, the poverty rate of the Bay Area is 17.1%, or around 1.3 million folks, and deep poverty rate is 1.68%, or around 130,000 folks. Now for some context of poverty in San Francisco. In 2018, a City of San Francisco performance scorecard estimated that 10% of residents, or around 88,000, were in poverty. The poverty rate is much higher in communities of color. For example, 30% of African American residents experience poverty, and 13% of Latino residents experience poverty, while only 7% of white residents experience poverty. Housing and Urban Development defined low-income limits in San Francisco as $82,200 for an individual and $117,400 for a family of 4 in 2018. And this was based on 80% of the area's median income. The impact of COVID-19 on residents experiencing poverty has led to food insecurity, a government term for lacking access to enough good, healthy, and culturally appropriate food. This has more than doubled statewide and more than tripled in some Bay Area counties. In San Francisco, for instance, 18.7% of households struggled to get enough food to eat in April and May of 2020, and this is up from 5.7% in December of 2018, according to the Institute for Policy Research at Northwestern University. For more information about food insecurity, please listen to our interview with Katie McKnight from the San Francisco Marin Food Bank in Episode 2. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.